why was Full Custom Garage canceled? In fact, it wasn't canceled. I quit. I said, I've had enough. Take this job and shove it. I ain't working here no more. Seriously.
He is a legend. Ian Roussel, the face of Full Custom Garage, the man who could turn scraps of metal into something that looked like art, alone in the desert. No team, no blueprint, just a vision in his head and the skill to bring it to life. For 9 seasons, audiences around the world watched him do what almost no one else could. Then, suddenly, he left the show after 13 years. This event shocked viewers and left them wondering what was happening to him. This was not a sudden decision. Ian had been carrying tragedies and personal pain for years. And to truly understand this story, we first need to understand who Ian Roussel really is. Ian Roussel grew up in Southern California, and from an early age. It was obvious that school was never really the place for him. The garage was his real classroom. That was where his instincts made sense, where his hands could do what textbooks never could. His talent did not reveal itself through grades, test scores, or anything that could be measured on paper. It showed up in the things he built. It showed up in metal, in shape, in motion, and in the kind of craftsmanship that made people stop and look twice. He did not follow the usual road into the trade. There was no formal training, no vocational school, and no official mentor guiding him step by step. Instead, he began the only way he knew how. He started building, and then he kept building, one thing after another, until the work itself became impossible to ignore. Over time, people noticed, and before long, they were willing to pay for what he could create. By the time he reached his early 20s, Ian had already opened his own custom car shop. He chose the Mojave Desert as the place to do it, a setting that felt perfectly matched to his approach. Isolated, raw, and completely his own. He built every car the same way, alone. He never relied on blueprints, and he never used computer software to map out his ideas. Everything existed in his head before it ever touched steel. Every curve, every proportion, every decision lived first in imagination and then in his hands. Long before television ever found him, his work had already become something distinct. It was not unusual in a flashy or attention-seeking way. It stood apart because it genuinely did not look like anyone else's. Ian was never interested in copying another builder's style, and he had no interest in chasing trends just because they were popular. What mattered to him was form, shape, the possibility of taking a piece of metal, stripping away every expectation attached to it, and letting it become whatever it wanted to be. He once explained that mindset with striking honesty. He said, "I am not even that into cars. This is my addiction, building them, creating all these shapes." That single statement reveals almost everything about who he is and why his work feels so different. It explains why watching him build does not feel like watching a typical car enthusiast at work. The energy comes from somewhere deeper and stranger than simple admiration for automobiles. What drives him is not fandom. It is compulsion. It is the creative obsession of someone who sees possibility where other people only see material. That is what gives his work its identity. That is what makes it feel less like fabrication and more like art taking physical form. The atmosphere around him reflected that same spirit. In his shop, the music was ministry and the Dead Milk Men. He described himself, without any embarrassment, as a punk rock kind of guy, and he never tried to smooth out that edge to make himself easier for a mainstream audience to accept. He was not interested in polishing his image or reshaping his personality for wider appeal. He stayed exactly as he was. That refusal to compromise became part of what drew people in. There was something magnetic about a person who seemed completely uninterested in performing for approval. He did not need to package himself. He only needed to keep creating. Even so, Ian was never entirely alone in the desert. His wife, Jamie, was an essential part of everything that made the operation work. She handled the business side, managed communication with clients, and over time became deeply involved in the production and editing of the show itself. Ian was the builder, but Jamie kept the structure around him functioning while he focused on making. She made it possible for that work to continue. Their partnership was quiet, but it was foundational. Everything the public came to associate with Ian Roussel rested on a system that the two of them had built together. What people saw on screen may have centered on his hands, his ideas, and his process. But underneath it all was the support system they created as a team. By the time MAVTV reached out, Ian had already spent 2 decades becoming exceptional at something most people could barely define, let alone do. That made him a perfect subject for television, and the medium recognized it quickly. But underneath that opportunity was a question almost no one seemed interested in asking. What does it actually cost to live like that? What is the price paid by a man whose entire identity is rooted in absolute authenticity when cameras arrive and ask him to repeat that authenticity for coverage, for angles, for one more take? And what happens to a body forced to endure punishing hours in desert heat, year after year, long before the final cost of that life finally comes due? When Full Custom Garage premiered on MAVTV Motorsports Network on March 28, 2014, it immediately felt different. Back then, car television was flooded with countdown clocks, manufactured crises, and the same predictable formula over and over again. Clients would storm in with impossible demands. Builders would fire back with dramatic ultimatums. Large production teams were carefully edited to look like underdogs barely holding everything together. The drama was industrialized, the structure was rigid, and audiences had been trained to expect that rhythm on cue. Ian Roussel arrived and did none of it. He worked alone. No support crew, no apprentice, no cast of side characters inserted to create tension, no blueprints, no computer renderings, no design software. He would look at a vehicle, let an approach take shape in his mind, and then start cutting metal. He narrated his own process in real time, calmly and almost casually, while punk rock played in the background. When he made mistakes, he did not hide them. When the material forced him to change direction halfway through, he explained it on camera as if that were the most normal thing in the world. What came out of that was a show that felt less like entertainment and more like watching a craftsman at work. And somehow, against almost every rule of what television was supposed to be, that became extraordinary television. Full Custom Garage held an impressive 8.7 out of 10 rating on IMDb. It ran for 9 seasons. Viewers did not describe it as something they simply watched. They described it as something they studied. Fans drove for hours to Mojave just to stand outside his shop. They rewound fabrication scenes over and over, trying to understand how Ian formed a certain curve or solved a certain shape. International buyers, collectors from Japan, Germany, and the Netherlands placed orders for his cars without ever seeing them in person. That kind of trust does not come from hype. It comes from a reputation built slowly, piece by piece, until the work speaks louder than any promotion ever could. As all of this was growing, Jamie's role grew with it. She managed operations, handled clients, coordinated production, and took on editing as well. On screen, the show looked like one man building alone. Behind the scenes, the business was a partnership. That contrast mattered, because what viewers saw was only the visible part of a much larger structure. The image was simple. The reality was not. Every episode, every deadline, every finished vehicle rested on a system that required both of them to keep moving, to keep producing. and to keep everything from collapsing under its own weight. But there was one truth the camera never fully captured, and that was the physical reality of the environment itself. The shop in the Mojave Desert had no air conditioning. Summer temperatures in the desert regularly climbed past 110 degrees Fahrenheit, or 43 degrees Celsius. And that was before adding the heat from welding, grinding metal, and working inside a steel building that absorbed sunlight all day long. Ian Roussel spent up to 13 hours a day in those conditions while filming a television show. Not once in a while, not for a short stretch, consistently, for years. The human body can compensate for extreme heat, but not forever. It breaks down. It has a limit. And when that limit is pushed again and again over the course of years, the damage begins in ways that cannot be negotiated away. From a couch at home, none of that was visible. Viewers saw beautiful machines taking shape under stunning desert light. They saw creativity, skill, and freedom. What they did not see was the cost. So what happens when the final bill finally arrives? What happens when years of 13-hour days in unbearable heat become something a body can no longer absorb? And what does that look like for a man who was never built to stop? By late 2022 and into early 2023, Ian Roussel's body began to break down in a way that could no longer be ignored. He spoke about it openly, not to gain sympathy and not to create drama, but with the same blunt honesty that defined everything he did. His body had collapsed. The physical toll was severe. Ian suffered a major heat-related episode, with symptoms consistent with heat stroke. The damage went far beyond exhaustion. It included mild kidney injury, the result of years of relentless strain in the extreme conditions of the Mojave Desert. This was not a case of someone overheating and needing a break. This was internal damage. This was the desert finally sending the bill for everything his body had been forced to endure, with years of accumulated cost catching up all at once. For a man whose identity was built on endurance, on pushing through, on continuing no matter what, this was more than a physical setback. It struck at the core of who he was, and it did not come alone. On May 5th, 2022, Dude passed away. Anyone who had watched Full Custom Garage knew exactly who Dude was. He was not just a dog in the background. He was part of the show's DNA, wandering through fabrication shots, quietly observing Ian at work with what fans liked to imagine was professional supervision. Dude gave the show a warmth and authenticity that most television could never replicate. Even MAVTV's own social media described him as one of their most beloved personalities. He was never a prop, never a marketing decision. He was simply there, as naturally as the metal, as constant as the music. Dude died of cancer in May 2022. Ian shared the news himself, and the response was immediate. Fans flooded in with messages, memories, and tributes. What it revealed was something deeper than viewership. People were not mourning a television animal. They were mourning something they felt they had lived alongside for years, something that had quietly shared space with them through the screen. The timeline became impossible to ignore. May 2022. Dude is gone. Late 2022 into early 2023, Ian suffers a heat-related collapse with kidney damage. Years of 13-hour days in extreme desert heat. Across 9 seasons of a television show that often demanded a pace at odds with how he actually worked. Something had to give. And eventually, it did. So the question becomes, how does someone like Ian Roussel respond when everything hits at once? Does he break down in public? Does he turn against the system that helped build his visibility? Or does he do something far more deliberate? Ian was not canceled. He was not fired. He was not pushed out by network executives. He chose to leave. On his own timeline and on his own terms. And more importantly, he had been preparing for that move long before anyone realized. By the end of 2023, the decision was made. He was done with television. The final episodes of Full Custom Garage aired in January 2024, closing out 9 seasons with quiet finality. No public bitterness, no dramatic announcements, no burned bridges, just a craftsman finishing what he started, and then setting it down. But here is the detail that changes everything. Ian and Jamie's YouTube channel, Full Custom Ian, launched on January 29, 2023, months before the last television episodes aired, before any public signal that the show was ending. He had already built his own exit. And when the time came, he simply walked through it. The philosophy behind the channel was the exact opposite of what had worn him down. Episodes followed the natural rhythm of the work, anywhere from 18 minutes to over an hour, depending on what the build actually required. Not what a broadcast schedule demanded. There was no artificial tension, no staged reshoots if Ian made a mistake. It stayed in the video if he had to rethink a method halfway through. Viewers saw the entire process unfold in real time. The confusion, the recalculation, the solution taking shape. That was not a flaw in the format. That was the format. It was everything television had stripped away for nearly a decade. Jamie fully stepped into the production role she had been building toward for years. Editing and shaping the raw footage with the same directness Ian brought to metal, the output was consistent, and the audience responded immediately, because what they were seeing now was unfiltered. This was Ian Roussel, without the layer of television between him and the viewer. The version that had always existed behind the scenes. The comments were filled with messages from fans who had followed him since 2014, many saying the same thing. They felt like they were finally meeting the real person. The Instagram account at full_custom_Ian grew past 172,000 followers. In 2023, Ian and Jamie appeared at SEMA, showcasing new builds and signing posters. Not as celebrities promoting a brand, but as craftsmen presenting their work. There is a difference between those two things, and Ian Roussel has always understood that difference better than anyone. Just as this new chapter was beginning to find its rhythm, as the platform was growing and creative freedom was finally returning, life delivered another loss. This time, it was different. It was not about health. It was not about career. It was about the physical place where everything had happened. In September 2024, Ian and Jamie Roussel closed the Desert Ranch shop. For years, that space in the Mojave Desert had been more than just a workplace. It was where the show was filmed, where hundreds of cars were built, where Dude once wandered between welding rigs, and where fans traveled from across the country just to stand outside and feel connected to something they cared about. When the closure was announced, the reaction online revealed exactly what that place meant. Fans shared photos from visits years earlier, along with stories about how watching Ian create in that space had changed the way they thought about craftsmanship, about creative commitment, and about what was possible with skilled hands and an uncompromising vision. Builders spoke about how seeing him work there reshaped their understanding of their own craft. Ian handled it the same way he handles everything else, with direct and unembellished honesty. That chapter was over. Holding on to the building after that point would have meant holding on for the wrong reasons. The work would continue, but it is worth understanding what was truly lost. Not just a building, not just a business address. Desert Ranch was a physical expression of an idea. The belief that one person, in a simple space, working alone, could create things of lasting value and beauty. That idea does not disappear when a building closes, but the place where it lived, where it was practiced day after day. That loss is real, and the people who mourn it are responding to something that genuinely mattered. So, after the pain, the health crisis, the end of the television era, and the closing of a legendary shop. Where does that leave Ian Roussel? Here is what the headlines often miss. Ian Roussel is still working, actively, consistently, and by every visible measure, more freely than he has in years. The YouTube channel, Full Custom, Ian continues to grow. He is now in a new shop, no longer carrying the weight of accumulated legend, building at a pace that would exhaust craftsmen half his age. One of his major projects, the 1949 Metro van, a vehicle he originally built and later regained, is now being prepared for SEMA 2025. Think about that for a moment. A piece from his past returning to him, being reshaped for a new chapter. Ian would probably shrug at the symbolism and go right back to cutting metal. Alongside it, there is a 1968 Volkswagen featuring a custom lighting system inspired by the design language of the Porsche 917. There are rat rods built from salvaged industrial equipment. The range of his work has not narrowed. If anything, it has expanded, freed from the constraints of episode formats that once required every build to fit neatly into a broadcast runtime. Viewers of his YouTube content often describe a noticeable shift in his presence on camera. He seems lighter, more open, more willing to stay in the thinking phase of a build. Those moments of stepping back, waiting, and letting the work reveal what it needs next. These are the moments television almost never had time for. Now, they are everywhere. Builders point to Full Custom Garage as the reason they believed this craft was worth pursuing. Younger viewers watched Ian work and, for the first time, understood what it looks like when someone finds exactly what they are meant to do with their hands and mind. That kind of cultural impact does not show up in ratings, but it is real, and it lasts far longer than any single loss in this story. The heat stroke scared people. The death of Dude broke something in the community. The closing of Desert Ranch felt like a door shutting on something many did not even realize they depended on. Each of those losses is real. But right now, Ian Roussel is in a shop somewhere. There is probably punk rock playing in the background. He is looking at a piece of metal and deciding what it is going to become. And no one, no network, no production schedule, no broadcast slot, gets to tell him when to stop. That is not a tragedy. That is freedom.